2:17 in the morning, Washington time, 43 American service members dug for cover inside a reinforced bunker at an al-Assad air base in western Iraq. By 2:19, the base had absorbed 11 ballistic missiles and a wave of armed drones. By 2:21, the United States Central Command had a decision to make. And by 3:04, Donald Trump had already made it for them, before a single general had been briefed. That decision has sent Washington into the most chaotic 48-hour stretch since the assassination of Qasem Soleimani in January of 2020. And here is what no major outlet is telling you about what actually happened next. This is not speculation. This is not rumor. This is reconstruction based on eyewitness accounts, CENTCOM public disclosures, satellite tracking data, and 3 independent sources too familiar with the National Security Council briefing, one from an adjacent Congressional Intelligence Committee. What those sources describe is not a crisis that surprised anyone in the professional security establishment. What shocked them was something else entirely. Something that happened inside the White House at 3:04 a.m. that none of them have seen before. We have 4 major revelations coming in the next 20 minutes. The first will reframe everything you think you know about how this administration responds to military threats. The second will expose a pattern that has been building for 11 months and that the major networks have refused to connect. The third will tell you exactly who calculated this attack to trigger maximum damage with minimum footprint and why the timing was chosen with precision. And the fourth will explain what this means for your gas tank, your retirement account, and the 40,000 American men and women still deployed in the Middle East tonight. Subscribe right now and turn on notifications because the next 72 hours will determine whether the United States responds to this attack with strategy or with spectacle, and the difference between those 2 outcomes affects every one of you personally. Let me walk you through how we got here. March 3rd, the Iranian-backed Kataib Hezbollah faction publicly warns that American forces at 3 designated Iraqi bases are legitimate targets following the U.S. Treasury Department's imposition of new sanctions on 11 Iranian oil intermediaries. Washington dismisses it. No public statement, no visible posture change at the bases named. March 5th, Israeli intelligence shares intercepts with the CIA indicating unusual drone assembly activity at 2 sites in eastern Syria. According to sources familiar with the briefing, the CIA assessment is rated at medium confidence. It does not reach the president's daily brief. March 6th, satellite imagery reviewed publicly by the Institute for Science and International Security shows accelerated activity at Iran's Fordo nuclear facility, specifically the installation of new centrifuge cascades in a chamber that had been dormant for 19 months. The Wall Street Journal runs a paragraph on page 14. No network evening news covers it. March 7th, a convoy of 11 vehicles departs an ONURG logistics hub near Deirez, or Syria, and moves toward the Iraqi border. US surveillance assets track it for 40 minutes. Then the feed goes dark. 3 separate sources describe a 17-minute gap in drone coverage that has not been explained. March 8th, Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi gives a 45-minute speech at the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva in which he uses the phrase disproportionate American arrogance 7 times. It is not a speech, it is a message, and Washington didn't see it coming. March 9th, 2:17 a.m. al-Assad absorbs the strike. Here is where this story takes a dangerous turn. 43 U.S. personnel were inside the blast radius when the first missiles hit. By the time CENTCOM issued its initial damage assessment 6:42 a.m. Eastern, the confirmed numbers were 14 injured, 2 critically, and $340 million in infrastructure damage, including the partial destruction of a hardened hangar housing 2 MQ-9 Reaper drones worth $64 million each. The numbers don't lie. In 90 seconds, Irani's proxies inflicted more infrastructure damage on a U.S. military installation than in any single strike. Since the January 2020 al-Assad attack that left over 100 American service members with traumatic brain injuries, an event the Trump administration at the time initially described as causing no casualties. But here is what the morning briefings didn't tell you. Receipt number 1. The attack used a combination of Shahid 136 loitering munitions and Fatih 110 ballistic missiles. The Shahid drones cost Iran approximately $2,000 each to produce. The Patriot interceptor missiles used to shoot down 6 of them cost $3 million apiece. That is a kill ratio of 1.50021 in Iran's financial favor. According to a Rand Corporation analysis from February 2025, Iran and its proxies have now forced the United States to spend over $1 billion in high-value interceptors to neutralize a total of approximately $4 million in drone hardware over the past 22 months. This is not a kinetic war. This is an economic attrition campaign, and Iran is winning the math. This proves that the cost asymmetry of this conflict has fundamentally changed the strategic calculus, and that no one in Washington is publicly acknowledging it. Now here is where you need to pay very close attention. At 3:04 a.m. Eastern, 47 minutes after the missiles hit and before a single member of the National Security Council had convened, Donald Trump posted on Truth Social, not a measured statement, not "we are assessing the situation." What he posted was this: that Iran had just made the single biggest mistake of any country in the history of warfare, and that the United States would be responding 100 times harder, fast and furious. He tagged Pete Hegseth. He tagged Marco Rubio. He tagged no one from CENTCOM, the Joint Chiefs, or the intelligence community. By 3:47 a.m., oil markets had spiked $8 a barrel. By 4:12 a.m., Lindsey Graham had issued a statement calling for immediate, overwhelming retaliation. By 4:31 a.m., Rand Paul had issued a counter-statement warning against another unconstitutional military adventure in the Middle East. By 5:18 a.m., Mitch McConnell's office had requested an emergency classified briefing and been told by the White House that no briefing had been scheduled. The silence from the White House was deafening. For 6 hours after the most serious attack on a U.S. military installation in 5 years, the National Security Council did not formally convene. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs did not issue a public statement. The Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, was not reachable for comment until 9:23 a.m., 7 hours after the strike. 3 separate congressional offices, 2 Republican and 1 Democrat, confirmed, 2 sources familiar with the situation, that no interagency war council had taken place before Trump's first social media post went live. And then something no one expected happened. At 9:47 a.m., Trump posted again. The phrase 100 times harder had disappeared. The new post read, "Iran wants to talk. Maybe we let them," in 43 minutes on the global stage. The United States had moved from promising the most devastating military response in the history of warfare to signaling openness to a phone call. Hit that subscribe button immediately, because what I am about to walk you through is a pattern that the major networks are not connecting, and it changes everything about how you understand this administration's foreign policy. Once you understand what actually happened here, you can't unsee it. This is not the first time. This is not the second time. This is the 11th documented instance in 11 months in which an Iranian-linked military action was followed by a maximalist Trump statement, a market reaction, a Republican civil war, and then a quiet reversal, all within a 48-hour window. Let me give you the receipts. Receipt number 2, on April 14, 2025. Iranian proxy forces in Yemen launched a coordinated Houthi drone swarm at the USS Dwight D. Eisenhower carrier strike group in the Red Sea. Trump posted within the hour that Iran would cease to exist as we know it if the attacks continued. 4 days later, the State Department confirmed that back-channel negotiations between Oman-based intermediaries and Iranian diplomats had resumed. Not a single retaliatory strike was carried out. The Houthi attacks continued for 19 more days. Receipt number 3. On July 22, 2025, a suicide drone struck us. Logistics outpost at Al-Tanf, Syria, wounding for service members. Tom Cotton gave a floor speech demanding an immediate military response. Marco Rubio, on the same day, described Iran as the world's leading state sponsor of terror. 3 days later, Rubio sat down with Iranian Foreign Ministry representatives in Geneva. The meeting lasted 2 hours and 40 minutes. Neither the White House nor the State Department confirmed it took place. Reuters broke the story 9 days later. Receipt number 4, on November 3, 2025. 4 separate Iranian proxy attacks across Iraq and Syria killed 1 American contractor and wounded 11 U.S. military personnel over a 72-hour window. Trump gave a speech at a Mar-a-Lago fundraiser that evening in which he described Irani's leadership as stone-cold dead men walking. By November 8, a $6 billion unfreezing of Iranian oil revenues, money held in Qatari escrow, had been quietly authorized by the Treasury Department in what an official called a pre-existing humanitarian carve-out. The Wall Street Journal editorial board called it the most significant ransom payment since the Obama administration. This is not an accident, this is a strategy. Iran's strategy: probe with drones, wait for the explosion of rhetoric, let the markets spike, let the Republicans tear each other apart, then wait for the reversal. Because the reversal always comes, and every time it comes, Iran extracts something: financial relief, diplomatic access, a reduction in enforcement pressure. The attack at Al-Assad last night is not a military operation. It is the 12th move in a very deliberate geopolitical chess match, and the question you need to ask yourself is, who is playing chess and who is playing checkers? Here is the part that keeps me up at night. Why aren't the major networks connecting these 11 incidents? Why has no Sunday show panel put the November carve-out next to the April rhetoric next to last night's strike and drawn the single most obvious line in the history of cause and effect? The answer is not complicated. It is uncomfortable. The story that Iran has successfully trained this administration's response mechanism, that the IRG understands Trump's 48-hour cycle better than the NSC does, is a story that requires calling the administration both hawkish and weak simultaneously, and that is a story no one in cable news has the appetite to tell, because their audiences on both sides of the political spectrum prefer a simpler narrative. But this channel exists precisely because the simpler narrative is the more dangerous one. Smash that like button if this is making sense so far. Drop a comment right now if you saw this coming. I read every single one. And subscribe immediately if you haven't yet, because what I am about to show you is the full pattern, and it does not exist anywhere else in this form. Let me now walk you through the psychological architecture of what happened inside Washington in the 12 hours after the strike. There are two factions right now inside the Republican foreign policy establishment, and last night's attack has forced them into open warfare. Faction 1 is the Tom Cotton Lindsey Graham wing. These are men who believe in deterrence through demonstrated force. Graham's 6 a.m. statement was not a media stunt. It was a genuine, strategic conviction that the only language the IRG understands is consequence. In Graham's framework, every attack that goes unanswered increases the probability of the next, larger attack. He is not wrong about the logic. He is wrong about the decision-maker he is trying to persuade. Faction 2 is the Rand Paul-led restraint wing. Paul's counter-statement at 4:31 a.m. cited the War Powers Act, the 2002 authorization for use of military force, and Article I, Section 8 of the Constitution. Paul is correct on the constitutional merits. He is also operating in a political environment where constitutional merits have not proven decisive, and then there is the decision-maker himself. Trump's psychology in a crisis like this one is not difficult to map, but it is consistently misread. He is a creature of the news cycle. He wins the day and loses the decade. His 3:04 a.m. post was not a strategic communication. It was a stimulus response. The attack happened. The attack was on television. The television required a response larger than the attack. And by 9:47 a.m., when the markets had already done the math on what 100 times harder, fast, and furious actually costs in blood, treasure, oil prices, and midterm polling in Michigan and Pennsylvania, the calculation changed. Trump is a landlord who mistakes dominance for strategy. He confuses compliance with loyalty and volume with leverage. What he does not understand, and what Irani's IRG planners understand with brutal precision, is that a threat only maintains deterrence value if the adversary believes you will carry it through. The IRG has now watched Trump issue maximalist language and then reverse course 11 times. They have built their entire operational tempo around that pattern. Trump threw a rock, Iran dropped a mountain and then waited. But what Washington didn't know was what was happening simultaneously across the Atlantic at 7:15 a.m. Eastern. While the White House NSC still had not formally convened, three events happened in parallel that no American network has connected into a single story. In Brussels, NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte issued a statement expressing grave concern about the Ain al-Assad strike and calling for a coordinated alliance response. That phrase, coordinated alliance response, is diplomatic language for do not act unilaterally. It was directed at Washington, and it was ignored. In Riyadh, Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman convened an emergency session of the Gulf Cooperation Council. Saudi Arabia had, just 9 weeks earlier, signed a landmark security cooperation agreement with the United States worth $142 billion. That agreement contains a clause, Article 7, Subsection C, that obligates both parties to consult before any unilateral military action in the Gulf theater. The Saudis were not consulted before Trump's 3:04 a.m. post. Sources familiar with MBS's response describe his reaction as incandescent. The Saudi Foreign Ministry issued a statement calling for de-escalation and diplomacy 40 minutes after Trump's threat to make Iran cease to exist, and in Tel Aviv, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who had been in a secure call with the White House at 2:58 a.m. 6 minutes before Trump's post, had reportedly urged restraint. Netanyahu's calculation was specific: any unilateral U.S. military action against Iranian territory before Israel had completed its own operational planning for a strike on the Fordo nuclear facility. would destroy the element of surprise that Israel had spent 14 months constructing. Trump's post went live anyway, 6 minutes after Netanyahu's call ended. The numbers don't lie. In the span of 45 minutes on the morning of March 9, 2026, the United States managed to alarm its closest Gulf partner, undercut its closest Middle Eastern ally, receive a public rebuke from its own NATO Secretary General, and signal to Irani's leadership that the threat of American military action was subject to a 47-minute shelf life. Washington didn't see it coming because Washington was too busy watching Truth Social to read the room. Let's talk about what actually happened here. Not the narrative, not the spin. What the evidence shows: Iran won round 12, not because they killed Americans, they wounded 14 and killed none, which, given the scale of the strike, appears deliberate. You do not fire Fat-E-11 ballistic missiles at a hardened military installation and wound 14 people by accident. You do it that way on purpose. The IRG wanted casualties low enough to prevent a mandatory U.S. military response while high enough to generate maximum domestic chaos in Washington. They got both. They spent approximately $4 million in hardware and achieved the following: a $340 million infrastructure strike, an $8 per barrel oil spike that generated billions in revenue for Iranian oil exports through third-party intermediaries, a Republican civil war between Graham and Paul that will consume Capitol Hill for the next 2 weeks, and a White House that has already publicly reversed its own position before a single congressional hearing has been scheduled. That is an extraordinary return on a $4 million investment. And the silence from the White House was deafening, not just in the hours after the strike, but in the strategic void it reveals. Subscribe and hit the bell, because I am going live within 48 hours to cover whatever comes next in real time. This story moves faster than any outlet is covering it. Here is what this means for you personally. Do you drive a car? The $8 per barrel spike that hit oil markets at 3:47 a.m. this morning translates at the pump to approximately 22 cents per gallon within the next 72 hours. If you live in a state that is already paying above the national average for gasoline: California, Illinois, Pennsylvania, Washington State, you are going to feel this before the week is out. Do you heat your home with natural gas? 19% of U.S. natural gas supply transits infrastructure that runs within the operational risk zone of the current Middle East conflict footprint. Any escalation that disrupts Strait of Hormuz shipping lanes, and the Strait of Hormuz is one of the 3 locations that Iran has publicly threatened to mine. If direct military conflict begins, sends natural gas prices to levels not seen since the 2022 European energy crisis. Do you have a 401k? The S&P 500 dropped 1.4% in pre-market trading on the first reports of the Ain al-Assad strike. Defense stocks surged: Lockheed Martin up 4.1%, Raytheon up 3.8%, General Dynamics up 2.9%. If you are within 10 years of retirement, you need to understand that what is happening in Iraq tonight is directly connected to the volatility in your retirement account this morning. And here is the number that Congress will not say out loud. The United States has spent, according to the Watson Institute's Costs of War project, 1. Congress is called back from recess. Tom Cotton introduces an authorization for use of military force targeting IRG assets in Syria and Iraq. Rand Paul filibusters. The Senate deadlocks along predictable lines. A limited US airstrike is carried out against a logistics site in eastern Syria, not Iranian territory, not a nuclear facility, nothing that Iran would interpret as requiring a strategic response. Iran fires another wave of drones within 2 weeks. The cycle continues. Watch for this scenario. If you see Pete Hegseth briefing the Senate Armed Services Committee before the end of this weekend, if Graham and Cotton hold a joint press conference before Thursday, scenario C, the structural break. This is the low probability, maximum consequence scenario, and it is the one that keeps professionals awake at 3 in the morning. A U.S. military strike hits Iranian territory directly, specifically a facility linked to the Fordo enrichment program. Iran invokes its declared policy of closing the Strait of Hormuz and executes a mining operation. Global oil supply is disrupted by an estimated 20% within 72 hours. Oil spikes to $140 per barrel. The U.S. enters a simultaneous military confrontation with Iran while navigating an active trade war with Canada and deteriorating relations with every major European ally. Watch for this scenario if Israel executes its own unilateral strike on Fordo before the U.S. has made a decision, because that strike would force the administration's hand in a way that no amount of Truth Social posting can walk back. And here is the part that keeps me up at night. The intelligence community's current assessment, according to sources familiar with the March 7 briefing, is that Iran is operating under a specific strategic assumption that the United States will not strike Iranian territory before the July 2026 midterm election cycle makes any military casualty politically catastrophic. If that assumption is correct, Iran has approximately 16 months of operational freedom to escalate with impunity, and they are using every hour of it. Here is the outcome of Round 12. Iran struck a U.S. military installation, wounded 14 American service members, inflicted $340 million in infrastructure damage, spiked global oil prices by $8 per barrel, generated billions in oil revenue through sanctioned intermediaries, triggered a Republican civil war in the Senate, forced the most powerful military on earth to reverse its publicly stated position within 47 minutes, and did all of it without losing a single soldier or spending more than $4 million. And while Washington was busy processing Trump's Truth Social timeline, something else happened that no major network covered. At 11:14 a.m. Eastern, while the White House press secretary was still declining to confirm whether the NSC had formally convened, Irani's foreign ministry issued a statement. Not a threat, not a denial, a statement. 7 sentences. The final sentence read, in the official English translation: the Islamic Republic of Iran remains committed to the principle that American military presence in the sovereign territory of Iraq and Syria represents an unlawful occupation, and it reserves the right to support the legitimate resistance of the Iraqi and Syrian people in defending their sovereignty. That is not a post-strike rationalization. That is a standing operational doctrine. It means they will do it again. The only question is when, how, and what. The administration's 48-minute reversal will cost America the next time. The Ain al-Assad attack is not a chapter in the Iran story. It is the chapter title. The story is still being written, and it is being written by people who have read every previous chapter far more carefully than the administration that is supposed to be responding to it. Subscribe and hit the notification bell. Drop a comment below with the answer to this question. Is Trump's pattern of maximum rhetoric followed by quiet reversal making America safer in the Middle East, or is it teaching Iranian Zerg exactly how far they can push before nothing happens? I read every single one. Send this video to someone who still believes that tough talk is a substitute for strategy, because the numbers are in, the pattern is documented, and the next wave of drones is already being assembled somewhere in eastern Syria tonight. The clock is running. The question is whether anyone in Washington is watching it.